All right, it is February 7th. Oops. It is February 7th, 2017. This is Engineering Ethics at NJIT. I'm Daniel Strada. I'm your instructor for the course. This is week 4, lesson 4 of Engineering Ethics. Let's go and jump into the course and take a look. Yeah, here we go. All right, let me shrink that down. Okay. Yeah, okay, so we're on lesson 4 this week. So last Friday, you turned in your lesson 3 essay on the Pinto, on consequentialism and the trolley problem. And then this week is the Dennis Droya reading. The lecture is already online. A few students complained about putting the lectures up on, I had been putting them up on Mondays, and they said that there wasn't enough time during the week to finish the essay. Oh, you can't hear me. Hello? No, it says my microphone is working. I think it's on your side, Brian. Can everyone else hear me? Is anyone else paying attention? Okay, good, that's good. Thank you, Kenny. All right, so we're doing lesson 4 this week. You wrote about lesson 3 last week. And I just want to go through, remember these Hangouts are for sort of discussion if you have any questions about the class, about the assignments. If you have any questions about the material, if there's things you want to talk about, that's the point of these Hangouts. You can think about them sort of like online office hours, and if you have questions, just show up and ask questions, just interrupt or, yeah, you can close the chat, that's fine. You can ask questions in the chat. The full lecture is online, and I put it up on Saturday this time. I'll try to get the lectures up on Friday or Saturday of the week before, so you have the full week to watch them. I'm still going to do the Hangouts on Tuesday. The Hangouts are really to get you going on the material, especially to help you write the replies from last week, and to answer any general questions that you have. Remember, you get attendance credit for both the Hangout and the lecture. Hello.
Hi.
Okay. So you get attendance credit for both the Hangout and the lecture. That credit is extra credit, though. You don't need to sign that credit off. If you don't watch the videos, you don't lose any points. As long as you do the essays, that's where the grade is. The videos are designed to help you. They're designed to supplement the material, and it's all extra credit. So, hello, someone at my door. Yes. Hi. Am I on the Hangout right now? Yeah. I just. Oh, you're on it. Okay, I'm on it right now. What's up? I just want to ask what the extra credit. Yeah. The videos. Yeah, I do videos for those, or can I do essays only? For the extra credit. You can do videos for those, for sure. Okay. Where are they going to be assigned? They're in a forum.
Barak, go inside.
On Moodle. Okay. Yeah. All right. I just wanted to quickly just before you got it. Yeah. Good. I'm sorry about that. So I had someone come to my office and ask a question in person. If you didn't hear it, they were asking.
You good. Don't worry about it.
You heard me. Yeah, so the question was, where do you turn in the extra credit assignments? And if you could do videos for the extra credit assignments. So the extra credit assignments, they become available on February 18th, so in a couple of weeks, next week, I guess. They're right here at the very top of Moodle. If you scroll to the top of Moodle, course announcement, syllabus, and then there's little extra credit essays. They become available on February 14th. The first one isn't due until March 10th, the ethics of your field. You can do videos for those. You can also do videos for your weekly essays. I haven't finished grading the last round of essays, so I don't know if anyone's done a video for last week. But the videos tend to be pretty interesting and pretty compelling. Record them, put them up on YouTube, or you can just upload the video directly to Moodle. If you feel more comfortable talking on a video or giving a sort of video presentation, speaking.
So for these 2 extra credit essays, what are the criteria for the essays on the syllabus or in the videos they were talking about on top of Moodle, or what's the criteria for them exactly?
Yeah, so the extra credit essay, here, I'm going to go back to my normal rules so I can look at the, so the extra credit essays, they're going to be just normal length posts, and they're just on topics that we don't cover as part of the core material of the course. So the first essay is ethics of your field. The idea is that, after we've gone through a couple of these case studies, and after we look at the ethical codes for professional engineering societies, we look at the NSPE, which is sort of the generic for all engineers code of ethics, but there are specific codes of ethics for specific fields. So there's a code of ethics for the chemical engineers and a different code of ethics for the software engineers, different code of ethics for mechanical engineers.
Oh, okay. So it's not like a legitimate like 5-page paper and nothing like that. It's just like a regular Moodle post that we've been doing, correct?
Yeah, it's a regular Moodle post. It's just on a special topic. This one, I want you to look up and sort of think about the ethics that apply to your particular career. It's extra credit because this isn't one of the required assignments of the course. If you want to put the extra effort into that, you get an extra 20 points for writing. And it's just a normal length essay. That's right, a normal Moodle kind of post. It would be nice if you did a little bit of research, in particular if you looked up the specific ethical code for your field, and maybe compared it to the codes that we've been talking about in class. The more effort you put into it, the more credit you'll get. And the second one is due at the end of the semester, and it's about remix culture. There's a documentary that I want you to watch. And we can talk about that later when it comes. These extra credit essays are just supposed to give you another avenue for engaging the ethics material and give you credit for that. Remember, the way that I grade is that I'm a little bit harsh on the posts themselves. And when I say harsh, what I mean is that my grading rubric makes people tend to get Bs on the posts. The average grade is going to be around an 80%. And I mean, that's harsh because most people want more than an 80% in an ethics class. So if you want the A, you have to do the extra work. You have to write a little bit more in your posts, and there's all these extra credit assignments. So if you spend that time, it's not hard, it's just more time. If you spend that time, you can guarantee that A. Thank you for the question. There is a required project due. So Tim asks in the chat, is there a required project due? And that is correct. The required project is for lesson 10. Here, I'll pull it up right now so you can see. So you have one major research project in class that's for lesson 10 and 11. Lesson 10 and 11, you're supposed to pick a case study that we haven't talked about in class. So the major case studies we do in class, we've already done a couple of them. We do the Challenger explosion, we do the Pinto case, we'll do Deepwater Horizon in a few weeks. But lessons 10 and 11, you're supposed to pick one case they'll talk about for both lessons 10 and 11. And you're required to do actual library research, which means find scholarly journal articles or investigative reports, that kind of stuff. Primary sources, not encyclopedia articles, not secondary sources. And so you need to do some library research, look up the facts of your case. In lesson 10, you give a report on what happened in the case, and then in lesson 11, you're going to give an ethical analysis of the case. Who was responsible, how should they be held accountable, how do we prevent this from happening again in the future? Lesson 10 and 11 essays are a little bit longer, like 50% longer than normal. And the big requirement is that you do the research, and that research will go into a bibliography for those weeks. For lessons 10 and 11, you will be doing more work than a normal post. You might think of it as your midterm. There's no real midterm. This is just additional requirements for these 2 weeks. I could make it for a final, but the idea is to make it sort of slightly after midterms and slightly before finals, where you might have a break in your other schedule to do some research. So the requirements are a little bit steeper. You have to do this annotated bibliography for lessons 10 and 11. You might even want to start thinking about this now. I think I start warning people in the syllabus around lesson 11. We're on lesson 4 right now, so we've got some time. I'm sorry, around lesson 7, I start telling people, hey, start thinking about their research project. All right, good. Any other questions about the assignment structure, about next few weeks of class. Let me go ahead and go back to lesson 3. Remember, you have your replies for lesson 3 due tonight. Remember, lesson 3 is where we introduce the Pinto case. And in particular, we introduce this, this challenge of putting on your engineering hat versus putting on your management hat. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That was the Challenger explosion. Sorry. We're doing the Pinto case. Pinto case was the consequentialist analysis with the trolley problem. Ford did this cost-benefit analysis with the Pinto, where it was, do we spend the money on an $11 part for these 12 million cars, or do we let the cars go on the road and then pay court settlement fees to all the people who die? And Ford decided to pay the settlement fees. It would be about a third the cost. So from a business perspective, it looked like the reasonable thing to do. But when Mark Dowie writes this article in 1977, several years after the Pintos have been on the road, and brings to national attention the fact that these cars are exploding in these gruesome fires, it causes a national sensation. There's a big media blowback. There ends up being these huge trials, right, where Ford gets brought to court on criminal negligence that ends in the death of a person. These court cases are among the most expensive lawsuits against a corporation, and it's the first time that a corporation has been brought on charges of killing a person, on manslaughter. Ford was eventually found not guilty of the criminal charges. They were found not negligent. Part of the thing that convinced the jury that they were not criminally liable was the fact that some of the engineers had bought the cars themselves and used the cars themselves, and had even bought like their family Pintos, knowing that they would explode. I remember Ford's justification was that the Pinto was dangerous, but it wasn't really that much more dangerous than the rest of the economy cars, which were already all pretty dangerous. They didn't really have any safety features. Ford thought, look, safety doesn't sell. When people are buying these economy cars, they expect them to be a little bit dangerous. So it would just not be a good business decision to spend a lot more money trying to make them safer when that's not what people are buying these cars for. Right? The market wants a cheap car, right, and a fuel-efficient car. They don't want a safe car. So the question, and again, there's not a right and wrong answer here. There's the point here is to think about the decision that Ford made and the ethics behind it. Was it the right decision to make? And I guess importantly, is the business decision the right decision for the corporation to make? Right, businesses are supposed to make money, and so you don't expect them to make the bad business decision. But when it ends in cost of human life, right, there's these ethical codes that the engineers are supposed to follow that put safety paramount. Right, the first canon of the code of ethics for engineers is the safety and welfare of the public. And you might think that when Ford is releasing this car for financial reasons, that they're not putting the safety of the public first. Right, they're putting their bottom line first. They're putting their financial interests first. And then, right, so then the ethics is, do you put your financial interests up against the cost of a human life? These aren't trivial questions. In fact, these are some of the core questions of working in a business at all, right? How far are you willing to go to make a dollar? And some companies are willing to go very far. Some people are willing to go very far. And how do you deal with that in a corporate environment? Let me go ahead and stop here and see if there's any questions or comments. I know you all just wrote your essays on Friday. Most of you wrote them on Friday. If there's anything in particular you wanted to talk about, if there are any issues from lesson 3. Yeah, so Bara asks, do you think Ford also considered how many Pintos they'd have to sell to cover up the expenses of a lawsuit? That's a good question. So one thing to consider here is that the lawsuits didn't come out until after the Mark Dowie article, which was in 1977. By this time, the Pinto was released in 1971. So by this time, it had already been on the road for 6 years. There were already 12 million vehicles on the road. So it wasn't a question of how many Pintos they already had out there. The question was, given the number of Pintos we have out there, would it make financial sense to go back and fix them all, right, put this extra part? And remember, Ford had the part. It wouldn't have cost Ford too much money to get the part. They already had it designed. They already had it patented. All they would have to do is just print up a bunch of them, 12 million of them, and install them on all the back of the cars. That requires, issuing a recall and getting all the cars to come in for this maintenance. And we know in the time since then, there's been lots of these kinds of problems with vehicles. Cars get recalled all the time for problems and all sorts of things. This is a very common occurrence today. Back in the 70s, this was a major deal, and Ford didn't want to do it. It was too risky from a financial perspective to issue this.
If I could just say something in my, I'm not sure if you read the weekly post, the main post yet, but on my post, what I put, I basically talked about how at that point in time, Ford was got some people, and they said, okay, so what do we lose? Like, what do we, off of both of these options? Like, what's the option that's going to cost us the least amount of money? And from my perspective, the very first thing I saw, okay, like straight dollar-wise, they were going to benefit more by just, from what they assumed from their math, just paying off any lawsuits from the deaths and injuries. That would end up being cheaper. Turns out it wasn't, but aside from that, assuming that their math was going to be correct regardless, I brought up the fact that in my article about brand image, they did not calculate what people would think of, like, let's just say that on the news that Ford, like Ford cars were blowing up here and there, people were getting injured, a few hundred died. I mean, yes, they managed to put a dollar value on the parts of the car or any damages to whatever, and they managed to put a dollar value on on a human life, albeit it was still wrong, but whatever. But they failed to put a dollar value on the brand image that they were putting out to the public. I mean, I know for sure that if I saw Ford cars blowing up, big case, blah, 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 like, I know I would definitely not purchase a Ford car, and I would advise others not to purchase a Ford car. And that, I feel like they did not take that into consideration when they were doing the mathematical calculations of what the costs would be. That definitely has some sort of dollar impact on their company, completely in a negative standpoint, but they just did not seem to rule that into the consideration of their dollar loss. I feel like that was a huge value too.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. That was Brian, right?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. Yeah, I think you're right, and I think even before you get into the ethics of the value of a human life, just the fact that they're not considered, right? They were only considering the cost of the part, and they weren't considering the cost of their image. They weren't considering the cost of their reputation. They weren't considering what customers they would lose. Right? All of these are considerations that were not part of their small calculation. Right? Their calculation was just not taking into account all these other things. Right? And so even before we get into trolley kind of problems about how much a human life costs, there's still this problem of the scope of ethical consideration. And you might think that Ford made the mistake very early on by having that scope so narrow that they just weren't taking into account these kinds of reputation things. One thought that I was having from hearing your comment was thinking about some of the Super Bowl ads. In particular, Audi ran a Super Bowl ad. I don't know if you saw it, if you watched Super Bowl. This is the one, right? Yeah, I think this is right. Maybe not. I didn't actually watch the Super Bowl. Oh, it's Ford following me on. Yeah, so the Audi ad has this sort of very progressive ad on the Super Bowl, trying to make it seem like a very progressive company. remember super rods are very expensive, and one of the things you have to remember is that the reason Audi is doing this is because Audi recently got caught in the emission scandal. Remember the VW emission scandal happened I think happened last year. Yeah, last year. Sorry, 2015. It's 2017 now. In 2015, it came out that VW was hacking its emissions monitors to be under regulations, to sort of fly under the radar. Well, it turns out it wasn't just VW; it was Audi and a bunch of other companies.
Was this I think this was the case where they used a defeat device in order to pass certain, because there's like certain regulations that your car cannot do. I mean, have like it cannot pass this much emission. Like it has to be good for the environment while still being a good car. And they would implement this device where it would activate upon testing, and then once tests were over, it was completely horrible for the environment. This was the case, right?
That's exactly right. This was the one where they had rigged the emissions device so that it looked right when the regulators were looking at it in the shop. But once you got on the road, the regulations were off, and so it was polluting far more than average. In fact, the VWs, I think, on a yearly basis, were releasing more just from this emissions error. We're releasing more CO2 than all of the UK combined. That they were failing to properly document how much their emissions were because of this scandal. So VW was caught in this, but Audi and other companies have also been swept up in this using the same kind of cheat to get around the regulations. So the point is that this is why Audi spends a huge amount of money on a Super Bowl ad, right? Some of the most expensive advertising time you can get. And the point is to repair its reputation because it's just been hit with a scandal. So this stuff is very expensive. Corporations today are a lot savvier about how to deal with the media and promote its reputation. They weren't as savvy back in the 70s. Let me get some of the comments in the chat. So Ruben says, sort of along these same lines, Ruben says, you have to take into consideration that at the time Ford was competing with Japanese automakers that were sweeping the market there. Not just Japanese automakers, but Korean automakers. The whole Southeast Asian auto industry was coming into its own at this time, and Ford was looking at it as a big threat. The compact sedans during the early 70s, so there's all of these issues sort of in the industry. I also mentioned in the lecture from last week that there was also a big blowback from the public in the decades prior, in the 60s, from the Unsafe at Any Speed, Ralph Nader book. It was in the 60s that all the regulations about safety belts, that people had to wear safety belts, that the cars had started to have certain safety features. This started to get pushed in the public in the 60s. There started to be these lawsuits in the 70s. This all accumulated so that today people care more about this stuff. Safety is a big concern for consumers nowadays. So Tim in chat says, people today rely more on consumer reviews, and I wonder how this has affected various industries, right? So, I mean, it's exactly right. People care more about safety today. Part of the reason they care more about safety today was because in the 70s, we had these incidents like the Pinto that caused a big media outcry. And as a result of that, you end up getting regulations about safety features. And nowadays, all the cars have, airbags and side airbags and crumple zones, and the whole thing is designed. Yeah, that crash test video. I like showing the crash test video in this class especially because you're engineers and you understand the work that had to go in, the design work, the engineering work that had to go in from taking those old cars. It might have looked nice, you might have liked the way they look, but they were just death traps. And then going to the cars that we have today, which look like little bubbles, look a little maybe less snazzy, but they'll save your life. You're not gonna die in a crash. You're not as likely to die in a crash. So, I mean, it's a big engineering marvel, and it's important to understand that the industry fought this engineering progress almost at every step of the way, right? For Ford, improving the car's safety was taking away from their profit margin, right? That's more, that's more design work we have to do in the car. That's more materials we have to put in the car. That means it's going to cost more. That means it's going to be harder to sell to consumers. right? These are all challenges to the industry. The industry would just like to be able to sell, a cheap car and sell it for a lot of money and make as much money as possible, right? But if the consumers are demanding these safety features, it raises the standards and it puts more pressure on the industry to perform. At the time in the 70s, the industry was fighting this very strongly. They were resisting all these changes, right? They said over and over again, safety doesn't sell, consumers don't want safe cars. Well, it turns out that consumers didn't know that they wanted safe cars. And once they realized that, no, we need our cars to be safe, then they started demanding them. Comments?
When looking at the Volkswagen case and comparing it to the Ford case, personally, I would say that these two cases are very similar to the point where Volkswagen. I mean, yeah, Ford was found innocent for the deaths and whatever, which in my opinion is complete BS because they're they're a multi-million-dollar company. Of course, they're going to be found not guilty, but whatever. I feel like personally, Volkswagen and Ford should have received a huge punishment because the degree at which they both committed, I don't want to say crimes, but these unethical acts is, they're both very serious to me because I remember studying this case previously, and okay, yeah, you might think of it as one car has a lot more emission than a regular car. I believe the specific number when I looked it up was 40 times more than that of a regular car. I believe it was. Don't quote me on that, but and it is a big number. But when you look at it from a bigger perspective, okay, like how many of those cars were sold? How many years has it been? Have they been doing this? And they were doing this, and this isn't just the first year that they were doing that. They were doing this. I don't remember the exact number. I did a case on this, but it was last year. And they've been doing this for several years back to back. And the number of hundreds of thousands of Volkswagen cars that have been sold using this device is just astonishing. And especially for the amount of time that it's been out, to the point where it might not directly murder somebody, no one's going to go to your tailpipe and inhale the fumes and die, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's really bad for the environment, and there's a regulation for a reason. If one person drives this car, it's not a big deal. There's no difference. But if several million people drive this car for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, then we are going to suffer the consequences as a society come in the future. So I definitely think that if anything, Volkswagen should have received a more brutal punishment than Ford, but that's my personal opinion.
Yeah, thanks again for that comment. So I just looked it up. Volkswagen rigging emissions for 11 million cars on the road. They've been doing this for a couple of years. So 11 million cars were subject to this emissions misreading, responsible for 1 million tons of air pollution every year, which is roughly the same as the total UK's combined emissions for all power stations, vehicles, industries, agriculture. Right. So it's like having an extra United Kingdom emitting greenhouse gases every year. That's not in the books, right? So I think you're exactly right that the cases here are parallel, and Tim mentions in the chat the tobacco company is another parallel case like this, where there's a growing public demand for companies to behave in some way, and the companies resist that as much as they can, to the point where they do these illegal, unethical things.
But one thing that, I don't mean to interrupt you, but one thing that's actually different in these two cases is that I think Volkswagen was more of the bad guy in this case, because yes, Ford developed the car, and then they came across this incident where, oh man, if we continue with this and sell it, we're going to incur debts and injuries. And they they basically put a dollar value on a human, and then said, okay, whatever, it'll be worth a couple people dying, right? So you have that Ford case, and then you have the Volkswagen where they intentionally from the beginning tried to get past the regulations. They went out of their way to install a device on millions of cars in order to trick the system into thinking that their car was eco-friendly when it wasn't. So yeah, both companies did bad, but I mean, basically, to put it simply, I would categorize it as Ford committing second-degree murder and then Volkswagen first-degree murder, if that's, to put it simply.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely differences here that are worth talking about. One of the things about the VW scandal, to me, is just sort of how hopeless it seems. Like VW, it's a major company, it sells millions of cars, and it doesn't seem like the kind of company you might think, because it has this sort of great brand presence, you might not think it's the kind of company that would do something like this. So when you find a company that is willing to lie about its climate change record in such a dramatic way, it makes the whole process, the whole possibility of dealing with climate change seem intractable. Climate change is the biggest problem that humanity faces, without a doubt. And if all the companies are cheating like VW's cheating, then we're just never going to deal with it. Like it's not going to be a fixable problem. But I don't want to get Ford off the hook entirely. So one of the things you said, Brian, that I want to fixate on a little bit, because it's really what the deep controversy is in all these discussions. So what you said, I think I remember exactly how you said it. You said these regulations are there for a reason. There's some sense in which that's true, but it's a very complicated thing to talk about. So, regulations are there for a reason. Sometimes that reason is safety. Sometimes the reasons are for different reasons. So when we go back to the Pinto case, first thing to say, remember that the way that our law works is that there's criminal cases and there's civil cases. The civil cases are when a person sues another person. A criminal case is when someone is found in violation of the law. Ford was brought up on charges of a criminal violation, but was not convicted of that criminal violation. But he was sued by people, and those lawsuits did end up going through. The lawsuits ended up not making very much money. So the original lawsuits were for $125 million worth of damages, the biggest settlements in lawsuit history. But eventually, Ford was able to settle that down to like $2 million, which was way more than they were expecting to spend, even in their own calculations. So Ford got off really easily. But one of the reasons they got off of the criminal case was because they weren't found in violation of the law. And part of the reason they weren't found in violation of the law is because the laws hadn't really been set by the time the Pinto was released. So their safety regulations, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, let me make sure I got that right. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is the government agency that's responsible for regulating the safety of cars, the building of roads and all that kind of stuff. So they're the ones that are supposed to regulate the safety of vehicles. So remember that Ralph Nader puts out his unsafe at any speed in the mid-60s, and this causes a public demand for regulations on vehicles, but they really hadn't come to any solid laws about what those laws they hadn't come to any concrete laws about what those rules should be, what those regulations should be. And in fact, the original National Highway Traffic Safety Administration rules for traffic safety didn't come out until after the Pinto was released. So Ford was not technically in violation of the law because the law wasn't in place when they had released the Pinto in the first place. Now, the reason this is challenging to think about is because Ford is a major corporation and they lobby the government extensively. They spend a lot of money lobbying the government. And one of the things this lobbying did was delay the passing of these traffic laws for a long time, for like a decade, right? Since Ralph Nader was pushing this stuff in the 60s, and it was almost a decade later before this stuff actually started being put into law. And the reason this stuff was delayed was because Ford and all the other automotive industries were delaying and causing legal problems and putting obstacles in the way so that the laws wouldn't get passed. Moreover, because of their lobbying efforts, they were also directly involved with the process of deciding what those laws should be. So remember that the $200,000 per life figure that Ford was using in their calculations, that wasn't their own figure. That was actually the figure they had taken from actuarial tables that the government was preparing for insurance purposes. And the reason that the government was producing these figures for how much a human life costs is because the industry was harping on this cost-benefit analysis. If you want to know how government can best help the industry, then you need to be thinking in cost-benefit analysis terms like we do. That's what the industry was telling government. So if you want to know what the best decisions for us to make is, start putting numbers on things, start quantifying things, and give cost-benefit analysis. That's how, Ford was saying that that's how the industry thinks about its own decisions. And so the government should be thinking about its decisions that way also. So this lobbying effort eventually results in the government putting the $200,000 figure on a human life, and then Ford using that for its own purposes. This ends up getting codified in the law, and then Ford is not responsible for the law. To simplify things, Ford helps write the laws, and then, surprise, they're not found guilty of the laws. This is the challenge with these regulations. So yes, the regulations are there for a reason. The regulations are usually put there on the premise that they help safety, that they help protect the public from dangerous things. But it's usually the industries that are lobbying the governments to write these laws. And so the laws and the regulations end up being very industry friendly. And it's often the case that the regulators are like friends, like personal friends with the heads of industry. And so there's these tight sort of nepotistic networks where it's very hard to hold the industry accountable because the regulators who are supposed to hold the industry accountable are, going to football games with them after work. So this kind of challenge starts in Ford, and we'll see this get even more dramatic, especially when we get to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Deepwater Horizon oil spill is BP, a big oil producing company, one of the largest corporations on the planet, and they completely destroy the environment. And all the regulators who are in charge with holding them accountable are also very friendly to them, or basically paid off by the corporation. And so, BP had a lot of fines it had to pay, but it's still a major world corporation. It still has an incredible amount of power and political influence. Same with Ford, right? Ford is putting these cars on the road that are literally blowing up and killing people, and people are still buying Fords. People are still proudly buying Fords, right? People are still like proudly Ford owners. Oh yeah, so I'm sorry, Emron asks, didn't Ford bribe them? Didn't Ford bribe the regulators? Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by bribing. Some of these bribes are legal, right? That's called lobbying. That's what lobbying is. Lobbying is just bribery, but it's a legal bribery. That's not, you can't stop because it's sanctioned by the laws. Yeah, I mean, that's how politics works, right? So politicians need to get reelected. Getting reelected costs millions of dollars. The presidential election costs billions of dollars. And those billions of dollars are paid for by corporations that want politicians that are friendly to their goals. That's why America's in the state that it's in. So there's a lot more to talk about this Ford Pinto case. Again, my point here isn't to just say that Ford themselves are bad. My point is to talk about how challenging it is to make ethical decisions where you have these industry decisions, industry pressures, you have financial pressures, you have political pressures, and all these things are intersecting and sort of locking you in on certain kinds of decisions, making it seem like some decisions are that you have no choice but to make certain decisions. And this is how evil things happen in the world, right? It's a bunch of people in these very complex networks who feel forced into making certain decisions because of the configuration of those networks. Right? So part of acting ethically when you go into industry is being able to see how all these networks fit together from a large enough perspective so that you can make the right decisions. I don't know if I've said this already, one of the challenges of teaching engineering ethics when we go over all these major case studies where, like Ford like literally kills people and still goes on its way and barely gets a slap on the wrist. Part of the challenge of this is you might come away from this class with the wrong lesson. The wrong lesson being that you can get away with quite a lot of stuff before you get in trouble. Right? And a lot of these case studies, you'll see that in fact they can get away with an amazing amount without a scandalous amount, without being held accountable. So, I mean, you might come away with a lesson with how little we hold these companies accountable for what they do. But I think the ethical lesson goes beyond that, right? It's given how hard it is to act ethically, right? How much of a challenge it is to act ethically, right? Can you still do it? Smith says Ford made a decision whose outcome was not good. I think that's a good point, and maybe that's something to say sort of theoretically about consequentialism. Maybe this is a good transition to the trolley problem. Consequentialism is not, does not require that you know everything that's going to happen before you make a decision. Often you don't know what's going to happen, right? Maybe Ford made a decision that they thought would be the best decision. Maybe they even thought that it would end in the least amount of hardship. But the problem was not what they intended. The problem was what actually happened. And what actually happened was all these people died. Right? So if the outcome was not good, the consequentialist is only worried about the outcomes. They're not worried about your intentions. They're not worried about what you meant to do. They're worried about what you actually did. Smith says if the article had not been published, I guess you mean the Mark Dowie article. If the article had not been published, then no such big thing would have occurred. Yeah. Smith, in fact, I think you're right that if Mark Dowie had not published the article, there would not have been the sort of media sensation and the big public blowback. The court cases might have turned out differently if that article hadn't been published. In fact, people have made this argument before. I want to say it's by Smith.
I want to go back for just a second when you mentioned consequentialists and when they don't necessarily care about what you meant to do, but what happened. Personally, I mean, in some cases, being results oriented is not the greatest thing, but at the same time, it's the only thing you have to base an opinion off of. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I mean, as in this case specifically, I totally would go for what happened, not what they meant to do. I mean, granted, like they meant to, like they knew that people were gonna die. They meant, to do all these things that did happen. But let's just say, for the sake of this assignment, that they intended to use the money that they planned on saving in order to donate to some whatever, and to have a more beneficial use for that money rather than just fixing a car, right? It doesn't, in my opinion personally, I don't necessarily think it matters what they intended to do with the project or the money. You have to look at bottom line what happened. If you set out for a project that'll end world hunger and it accidentally causes World War III, then that's not good. I mean, like, yeah, these are, very exaggerated. It was a very exaggerated situation that I just proposed. But at the same time, you have to look at, like, what you meant to do doesn't always happen, and what happens and sometimes it ends up being very bad to the point where you can't just be like, oh, okay, well, they meant to do this, they meant to do that. Like they had good intentions in mind. You can't just do that all the time, because a lot of the times people have good intentions, but what they do is very bad, or it has a bad result. So I think that in this case we can't look at, I mean, yeah, what they meant to do is what happened 100%. But if let's just say if the case comes up where they just say, oh no, we meant to do this, we meant to do that, we had good intentions, we could easily say, well, it doesn't really matter what you intended to do at that point. Well, it doesn't really matter if you intended to do something good. It just, what matters is the fact that you injured these people, you murdered these people, and the worst part is that you knew that they were going to die and you let it happen.
I'm like Brian, you're totally right. But one thing I'd like to say that the article which I read, it says that the Pinto, they decided, if they had decided to add the safety bracket, then they would have charged the customers. So the Ford wasn't gonna get charged for any of the money for the uh, adding the safety brackets. So what I think is that the Ford, it took the money of the people's dying on its head, and instead of letting the other people like their customers suffer, they decided that they would incur some loss and let the thing get going.
Yeah, that's see, like that brings up an amazing point. I think I read that each car would have costed $11 to input this shield in order for the cars not to explode or catch on fire, right? And yeah, it would have, with the thousands and thousands of cars, it would have had an immense cost. But I'm pretty sure that customers would have gladly paid $11 more for their car, because it's not like you're buying a lollipop. Like if you're paying like 50 cents for a lollipop and you charge an extra $11, you're not going to buy it. But if you're buying a 3, 4, I mean, like, I'm not really sure what the price of the car was at that point in time, but comparing it to nowadays, a regular car, I mean, you could get a decent car for a good, $30,000-$40,000. You can get a good car, right? I'm pretty sure that if someone were to come to me, say, hey, there was a huge mistake, the car catches on fire, if this such and such thing happens, let's just say that, translating it to today's money, if it wasn't $11, let's just say that it was $500. I know that this car that we told you was $30,000, but in order for us to fix this problem, it would cost $500. Ford would pay half and you would pay the other half. Is that okay? I would gladly pay $250 to ensure that my life is definitely safer. Like, I'm pretty sure if you were to ask the people who died from this or incurred some type of injury, that they would have definitely said, yes, $11, here, take it. Just secure my life. Like, it's kind of like what you said before, Professor. Like, people didn't know that they wanted safety because it was already assumed that the cars were safe. I mean, up until that point, there was no incident that capitalized the importance of safety. And when that happened, it was kind of like, okay, we have set regulations, or else this is going to keep happening.
I like to say that in 1973, National Highway NHTSA, they came across the problem that, Ford, the Pinto car, that had a problem with its safety. They tried to figure it out, but they couldn't find out. So I think that people around, like the customers and everyone, knew that this was a kind of problem in the Ford Pinto. But still, if you see the amount of like cars produced in the next years, like 1974, it was like 500,000 cars were produced around. So it's like people knew that, but still they didn't want anything to happen. And it's like everyone's personal tendency is like, I drive safe, so nothing will happen to me. So why even spend $500 for that? So what I think is like, people wanted that their car should be safer, but they thought that they drive very perfectly safe, so nothing's going to happen to them, so they won't spend even that much $500 also for that. So I think that even if Ford had like $11 is like equivalent to $500 if you say that. So if Ford had issued saying that, okay, whosoever wants to have the safer car can come to the dealers and get that safety bracket installed, but still what I think is not many people would have come and got that done.
You see, but at that point, but here's the thing. I totally agree with you. Some people are very stingy with their money. Some people are very, greedy. And if I feel as though, even if, let's just say that Ford said, hey, there's this situation with the car. If you pay this much, we can fix it. If not, you could still purchase the car in the state that it is. At that point, it's okay, I think, because Ford is informing their customers of a situation that's happening in their car. They are letting them know that they have an option to drive safer at a somewhat additional cost because of Ford's mistake. Ford's taking credit for that mistake, and they take blame and all that, and they're giving a solution. Now, at this point, it's the customer's choice. You know, if the customer chooses to save a couple $100 and not go for the safer option, then the fault of that death or that injury falls onto their own hands. You know, you cannot blame Ford at that point for saying, well, you made a safe car. Well, you accepted the fact that you were going to buy a faulty car, and you chose not to pay the slight extra for the shield or the safety, or the safety enhancement features. You know, we had let you know that you were purchasing a car that was faulty, and then you chose to buy it the way that it was. Your husband died, your wife died, such and such. I feel really sorry, but at that point, they had agreed and signed off to purchase the car in the state that it was. Therefore, it's not our fault.
Just to say a couple of things. First of all, Leah Coco wanted people in the chat said this, but Leah Coco wanted the car to be $2,000, 2,000 pounds, $2,000. $2,000 in 1973 money is like $11,000. So the Pinto was like an $11,000 car today. It's a very, very cheap car. I don't know if they even sell $11,000 cars today.
I mean, you could make the argument. Yeah, I guess you could make the argument that people buying cheap cars are buying cheap cars for a reason. They don't have the money to purchase a car that's more expensive. So yes, an additional $500 cost is greater than if you were buying a $30,000 car, which I understand. But at that point, as long as Ford is telling the customers, they're letting them know, they're warning them, they're forewarning them, and proposing a solution for an extra cost, then the fault no longer goes on Ford. I mean, yes, you can kind of say, well, they still put out a car knowing it could kill people. Well, you're informing the customers, you're letting them know that they're buying a death trap, and they can fix the death trap for a small fee. I mean, a small fee, medium fee, whatever, whatever your opinion is. But, they're giving them alternatives, and not taking the alternative is your fault. Either get the alternative or buy another car.
Yeah, so just one more little bit about, so $11 part on a $2,000 car. $2,000 is about $11,000. $11 is about $65. So not $500, but like $60 today in today's money.
Yeah, see, that's a very small cost. Even if Ford didn't even have to pay all of it, Ford could have said, you know what, we'll pay 3/4. Or we'll pay half, or they could have just put it into the price of the car before it went onto the market. Therefore, customers kind of wouldn't really know that that's what the extra, $65 was for at that time. I mean, personally, they could have done so many things, but they chose to go with the most greediest of plays and the most incorrect, in my opinion.
Yeah. So so the idea of informing the customer, it's a good point, and right, part of the ethical failure here, I think you're right, is not just that Ford released the cars, but it didn't take any effort to inform the customers about the safety hazards with the car. Right? If they knew that there were safety hazards, their minimum responsibility is to tell the customers. But I want to caution against thinking that merely telling the customers gets them off the hook. Just because you tell the customers doesn't mean you can sell them a death trap.
No, right? No. I had said telling the customers and proposing a solution to fix it for the $65 fee. I mean, like, don't get me wrong. You are correct in the fact that Ford is not completely at fault for selling a death trap. However, I feel like once Ford proposes a solution, they inform the customer and they say we can fix it at this small cost. Then at that point, the blame does not fall 100% Ford, 0% customer. It's more like 60 to 70% customer, and then 30 or 40% Ford, more or less.
Let me use a related example: the Samsung Note 7s or whatever that are exploding in people's pockets on airplanes.
Yeah.
Once we know that those devices are faulty and that they might explode in your pocket, Samsung shouldn't be allowed to sell those anymore. Even if the customers know, like, they need to be taken off the market. Those are a hazard for anyone. And if someone buys them anyway, it's probably just because they don't know any better, right? They're not informed about the purchases they're making. And in some sense, I mean, that's why you have to take them off the market entirely, because they're not safe to be on the market, even if Samsung is telling everyone that they're not safe, right? Part of the reason you tell them when it's not safe is so that they get them off the market as soon as possible. But my point here is just that the obligation is not merely to tell everyone, but it's also to make sure that you're not putting an unsafe product on the market. Now what counts as unsafe? I mean, an electric drill might be unsafe in certain ways, but there's ways you can use it that's perfectly reasonable, and you can. But as long as people are informed about what the dangers are and how to use it properly. Part of the problem is that the Ford would explode even when you were using it properly, right? If you got rear-ended, it's not your fault. It's not you did anything wrong, but that might cause an explosion. And the Samsung phone, right? It's not because the users are using it in an improper way. It's because the device itself is faulty, right? So when the device itself is faulty, I think it goes beyond just informing the customers. I think there's a requirement to actually get it off the road. Secret word. Let's make the safe word words 3. WW3. WWIII.
Well, can I just type in WW and then the number 3, or has
Yeah.
to be?
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me put it back in the WW3 or WW3. Either of those will work. I don't have the quizzes up. I'll do the quizzes as soon as I hang up off the chat right here.
Okay.
But that'll be the caps locks doesn't matter. So WWIII, all lowercase will work also. So thanks, Brian, Bara. Thanks for the conversation. There's a lot of stuff to talk about with the Pinto case. You all have replies to do about last week's lesson that I'd recommend doing. One thing I just wanted to mention really briefly is to say that some people have talked about the Ford cases being overblown, that the Mark Dowie article drew more attention than the Pinto case actually warrants. This Gary Schwartz article called The Myth of the Ford Pinto Case. He basically talks about how the Pinto case has been mythologized for engineering ethics courses just like this to make Ford seem like a really bad guy and to seem like the ethical situation is really clean cut. And this article makes the argument that no, in fact, it's a lot more complicated than that. So if you're interested in some other perspectives on the Ford Pinto case, this stuff has been talked about to death. This is an article from 1991.
Well, I don't necessarily think that it's the case of, like, yes, in some situations, this case might be exaggerated in order for learning purposes or other things like that. But it's definitely in this society nowadays, everyone's learned to only care if it affects you. Let's just say that something occurred in my family, like there was a death in my family. Not to say that you you specifically are a bad person, but you, professor, you wouldn't really care. I mean, yes, okay, I feel sorry, blah blah blah, but at the end of the day, like, I still have my life, you have your life, and sorry about that, and that's the truth of the fact. But if it was a death in your family, then you would feel a different way. And in the same case for this Ford case, the people who experienced a loss or injury because of this case feel strongly about it. They say, it was definitely wrong, it was the wrong thing. And some people who just didn't experience anything, they bought the Ford and luckily just never happened to, get into an accident or anything like that. Or people who just don't have a Ford, who just don't care, like, because they never experienced it, they just genuinely don't have a formed opinion about it. They just don't care if it doesn't affect them. It's, it doesn't matter. If it's something that affects everyone, like, for example, if there was a fun, kind of like with the Samsung, or let's just say that there was a similar situation where all iPhones would implode, after a few hours of usage, I'm pretty sure that everybody would make a huge deal out of it, and rightfully so, because it affects all of us. But if it only affected 20, 30,000 people, yes, it would be a big deal, but at the end of the day, most people would say, okay, whatever, wait till it's fixed and buy a new one. Like, that's what most people would say, because it's not affecting them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think this goes back to this issue of the scope of ethical consideration. what you're actually bringing into consider, right? So if it affects you personally, that changes how you think about it, and if it doesn't affect you personally, it doesn't change. I mean, you have a different perspective on it. Part of the point here, and especially leading into next week, to lesson 4, this week's discussion, is that when you're part of a company, that can also change your perspective. It can make you loyal to that company and to think about things from the perspective of that company, even when it goes against not just the public safety, but even when it goes against your own perspectives. So Dennis Joya gives this article, Pinto Fires and Personal Ethics, where he describes his decision-making process when he decided, and when in meetings they decided unanimously not to issue a recall on the Ford. Right? They saw the burned out vehicles, and they decided not to recall the cars anyway. And Joya's explanation is because he had a job to do, and the job gave him certain requirements, right? And there was a script to follow. This is how you do the job. And it was because that was the context he was operating in, right? Because that was the scope he was operating in.
Professor, just really quick, I want to interrupt. I have to go for a class. Just to double check, the secret word is WW3, right? World War III, correct?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm sorry, I have to leave for a class, but thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, friend. So I'm already over an hour, so I want to just quickly talk about the trolley problem, and then maybe we'll save some of the stuff we talked about for lesson 4. We'll talk about that next week. But so last week, we were talking about this cost-benefit analysis from Ford, and the philosophical way of talking about this is with the trolley problem. Trolley problem's a thought experiment from the 1970s. Hello. Let me throw this. Thank you. So the trolley problem is supposed to be a thought experiment for deciding one decision or another based on a cost-benefit analysis. Right. So the standard problem is there's one person on a trolley. I'm sorry. There's 5 people on the trolley tracks. If the trolley keeps going, it's going to hit those 5 people and kill them all. But you can pull the lever and divert the tracks onto a side track and kill 1 person instead of the 5. And then do you pull the lever? Right. The idea here is precisely to put the human lives in a cost-benefit analysis scheme. So maybe you can't put a value on one human life, but maybe one human life is just as valuable as another, right? So you can compare them, right? So 5 human lives are more than 1. So the idea is that you should pull the lever because you save more lives that way. And the challenge of this is that you don't always want to make that decision. I mean, for one thing, it might be hard to push the lever, right? Because you know that when you're pushing the lever, you're condemning this one person to die who wouldn't have died anyway. I mean, you might be saving 5 people's lives, but then there's also this one death on your hands. And that might be a burden to bear. And so do you shoulder that burden of having to kill someone in order to save these other people's lives? Is that a decision you're willing to make? So the trolley problem here is supposed to be, just a fork in the road kind of case where you can choose one, you can choose the other. They have different consequences, and then on the basis of those consequences, you make your decision. Yeah. So people in the yeah, I haven't put up the Hangout secret word quiz yet. I will do that right after I hang out from class. Amaka, I can delete your old quiz so you can retake it. I would strongly recommend not taking the quizzes until you actually watch the videos. Okay. Tim was talking about the trolley problem. I don't know if Tim is still around. Yeah, he's still around. I'm not sure what questions you have, but we've already seen some of these challenges. So one of the challenges that we've already talked about is the special relations, right? So ethicists talk about this in terms of special relations. So you might normally think that one person is less than 5 people, so you want to save the 5 people, you want to sacrifice the one person to save the 5 people. But what if you have a special relationship to that person, right? What if this person is your mother? Well, then maybe you're going to be really reluctant to pull that lever, even if it can save 5 different people. Or if you don't know these people, you know your mother, then you might have a special pull to saving your mother, even though the cost-benefit analysis doesn't work out that way. So the question is, given the consequences, what decision do you make? You can give lots of different variations. The most famous variation is the fat man variation, where in this one you have to push the man onto the tracks. Pushing the man on the tracks will kill that one person, save the 5. And the interesting thing is that people aren't willing to push the man. They're willing to pull the lever, but they're not willing to push the man. So this is called the problem of distance, that when we're further away from something, even just spatially further away from something, it makes it easier to commit unethical acts than it is when they're right next to you. Right? This is why online bullying, right? People who were very nice people in person might be bullies online. Why? Well, because you're really far away from that person, right? You don't see the consequences of their actions, of your actions. You don't see the impact it has on them. All you see are the things you're doing that are far away and distantly removed from the consequences. Right, so pulling a lever is easier to do than pushing the man, even if they have the same consequences, but because you're further away from the person. You think you pull the lever for the one that loops around, for the one that circles back. Kill the one first and then kill the 5. Yeah. I mean, yeah, so there's no right or wrong answers to this. Some of these are just meant to be jokes. Although, not entirely. So this one, where this person's 1 year old and these people are all 90 years old, this is how the ethicists actually do these kinds of thought experiments, where they're comparing different kinds of life. Right? So what if these are all convicted criminals, and this person is a straight A student or whatever? Right? How do these aspects of the people affect the way that you do the calculus, the way that you do the decision making? Yeah, so there's endless variations of these. You can go online and find lots more examples of the trolley problem. I want to emphasize one more time the difference between pushing the man and pulling the lever, mostly because this is an engineering ethics class, and you're going to find yourself as engineers very often to be in the case of pulling a lever, of making some engineering decision that could have life or death consequences down the road, but that you don't actually see when you're making your design choices. So be thinking about this. Be thinking about the relationship of distance, how being removed from these situations makes it easier, right? Dennis Droya, in this week's lesson, the Ford Pinto case, Dennis Droya, he sees these pictures of these burnt out Pintos, but he's not actually seeing the Pintos themselves, right? He's just seeing the pictures, and he doesn't know anyone who died in those Pintos. And his whole experience is being inside the Ford Corporation, following the rules of his job, right? So everything that he sees is reinforcing his decision-making on behalf of the company. And he has this huge amount of distance from the actual impact it has on people in the real world. Bara, to take this scenario, a trolley packed full of Camel cigarettes passes a flaming Ford Pinto and is headed towards a group of teenagers tied to the tracks. You have a choice of pulling the lever, which would direct the trolley away from the teenagers, but would also expose them to a large cloud of tobacco smoke, which they would all become addicted and eventually die from, or simply allowing the trolley to roll over and kill them instantly. Right? Do you want the immediate death of the trolley or the slow, painful death of lung cancer? I mean, right? These exactly. I mean, Bara understands exactly how these trolley problems work. The idea is to pose some situation where it's one or the other, and the decision has some moral consequence. Now, just to preview for this week's, because you'll be doing it this week's lesson, this week we're going to be talking about, well, let me actually go to just lesson 4. In lesson 4, we're going to be talking about Dennis Droya inside the company making the decision, but we're also going to be talking more generally about the psychology of obeying commands, right, of following your role, of following a script, of doing what you're told. Because it turns out that even more than being greedy, right, even more than being selfish and self-interested, human beings are obedient. They're conformists. They do what they're told. And that has even, the shock experiment, right, the Milgram experiment. We'll talk about the Milgram shock experiment. It was a very famous experiment from the 1960s. That shows just how far people are willing to go to listen to authority. And then we'll also talk about some of the consequences of this, the Eichmann trial. I didn't really talk about this much in the lecture. I might have mentioned it, but maybe we'll talk about this next week, the Eichmann trial. Right, I mean, people are selfish, people are greedy, but maybe even more ethically important than that. People are followers. People do what they're told. And a lot of the evil in the world is a result of people sort of unquestioningly do what they're told. And especially as engineers, you're going to be given a lot of orders. You're going to be asked to do a lot of things. Maybe some of those things you shouldn't do. And part of the challenge is knowing that you shouldn't do those things and having the right context, having the right scope of consideration to find when those things are that you shouldn't do them and actually standing up and not doing them. It's not trivial. A lot of your psychology weighs against it. But it's incredibly ethically important, right? The only thing that ever stops bad guys from doing bad things are the good guys who intervene, right? The good guys who understand and stand up. Maybe talking about this in good and bad is a little too simplistic. I'll go ahead and stop here. I think I've covered most of lesson 3. You all have your replies to do for lesson 3, so I'll go ahead and let you do those. Yeah, at the end of the Prezi, I talk about donating to charity. I talk about the tobacco cases. Some people mentioned those in the comments. Go ahead and talk about those online. And we'll come back next week and talk about obedience and conformity in psychology, the shock experiments. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Any last questions before I hang up?
Yeah, can you confirm what's the Hangout secret word?
Yeah, the Hangout secret word is World War III.
Okay. And then the other one would be then what's on the presentation?
For the lecture, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I say the lecture word in the video for the lecture.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions, comments? Stay off the tracks, everyone. Thank you, Tim. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you next week.